Okay, are you ready? So as I said, this is a speech for simultaneous. It's about how to feed the growing population. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It is perfectly natural to wonder, to just question ourselves about what will happen in the future. Partly just out of curiosity, and partly because we, as human beings, need to plan ahead. One of our aims on this earth is to survive for at least a while. So, and if you're going to survive on this planet, then you need to engage in a bit of planning. We need to have a rough idea, for example, where our next meal is coming from. And in the longer term, we need to know, for example, that we have a job that will allow us to earn enough money to buy enough food to eat for ourselves and then for our families. So that's when you think about it on the individual level. And if you think on a kind of more macro level, a larger scale, the whole of society needs to plan ahead to make sure that we, as humanity, has enough food to eat for the future. Now, this can seem quite simple. You might assume that it shouldn't be a problem because nature has always looked after itself in many ways. For example, the way that trees and plants are designed means that the leaves might fall off the trees or the seeds might get blown away. They'll land on the ground and some of them will manage to grow into more plants. And there's a cycle that perpetuates itself. And then if you want to take a more proactive approach, there's also farming. So farmers might then learn the best ways to produce more food more efficiently rather than leaving the plants to reproduce themselves. So they cultivate the crops, they grow and sell the food, and people buy the food to eat. Nice and simple. But of course, you and I both know that with the growing world population, as well as the range of unpredictable factors that can affect our food supply, such as war, droughts, climate change, and natural disasters, it would be quite naive to assume that we can just carry on living in the future without planning where we're going to find or how we're going to produce enough food to feed everyone. Especially when you consider that, according to statistics from the United Nations Population Fund, the world population has grown from 7 billion people in 2011 to 7.5 billion in 2017. From 7 to 7.5 billion in just 6 years. That's an increase of 500 million in 6 years. So logically, this trend is set to continue. To deal with this increasing population, according to the World Bank, we will need to produce 50% more food by 2050 if the global population continues to rise at the current pace. So when we're faced with a dilemma such as this, there are often two main types of solutions. Some solutions involve technology, and others might be more to do with changing the way we do things. In other words, behavioural change. For example, let's look at a different problem, not food. If you look at waste, for example, you could opt for a technological solution involving disposing of waste more efficiently with clever machines, for example, or instead, you could focus on just trying to produce less waste in the first place, and that involves changing people's behaviour. So when it comes to food production, there are two different approaches that spring to mind about how we could deal with this issue. We could either find technological solutions to produce more food based on the existing production models, or we can change the way people consume and produce food and their attitudes towards it. So let's look at these two options. On the technological side, we could focus our energies on what is known as automated farming. And in fact, this is something that's already happening to a certain extent. It's possible to assume that in the not too distant future, our fields could be tilled, sown, tended and harvested entirely by fleets of autonomous machines that cooperate with each other, some of them on the land and others in the air. And these machines, of course, can work day and night. I'm sure you've heard of driverless cars. Well, we also have driverless tractors. Some farms are using them and they can follow pre-programmed routes across the field. So they know where to go and what to do, and they just maybe work all night. So as well as driverless tractors, there are also drones being used in farming. I'm sure, again, you must have heard of drones. In a military context, they're quite well known at the moment, but also in farming, drones are used to fly over fields to assess the health of the crops and the conditions of the soil. Not only that, but there are also, in some farms, there are sensors in the ground to monitor the amount of water and nutrients in the soil. And they can even automatically trigger different processes. For example, if more water, irrigation is needed, then the sensors can detect when that's needed and automatically water the plants. So in theory, if all of these types of technology, the drones, the sensors and the driverless tractors, are used together, then it goes without saying that the quantity of food produced could be drastically increased. But even if that does happen, can it really carry on indefinitely? Can we keep doing that forever, just producing more and more and more? The other approach I wanted to mention is different from that, and it involves not focusing on just producing greater and greater quantities of food on an industrial scale, but instead taking a different approach. Have you ever heard of permaculture? Permaculture is a word made up from two different words, perma from permanent and culture from agriculture, or culture as in cultivation, or growing in other words. So this word permaculture has been coined to describe a whole process, a whole type of farming and approach to food. Now, permaculture does have many definitions. Believe me, I looked on the internet and tried to find a concise definition, and it's quite difficult. But essentially, as far as I understand it, permaculture involves understanding nature and producing food in a way that replicates the Earth's natural processes. It's a whole philosophy and a set of principles that involves understanding nature, living in harmony with nature, minimizing waste, and also trying to minimize humans' impact on the environment, rather than trying to just see the Earth as a big sponge that we can just keep squeezing to get everything out until it runs dry. According to one definition of permaculture that I found, permaculture is a way of life which shows us how to make the most of our resources by minimizing waste and maximizing potential. Living ecologically like this doesn't necessarily mean giving everything up, but relearning the value of nature and understanding new ways of understanding new ways of what it means to be wealthy, to have everything you need. Permaculture also aims not to cause environmental damage. The aim is simply to meet our basic needs and leave the Earth even richer than we found it, rather than draining it of all its resources. So I won't go into all the detail because there are a number of ways of adopting permaculture. But I'll just give you one example. One of the main principles is to produce no waste. So that might be on a small scale, for example, if you have a garden, you're producing vegetables in your garden, you find ways to reuse every bit of leftovers from your kitchen and from your garden. So composting is one example of that. You might grow vegetables in your garden and then you eat them. And of course, there'll be some leftover. There'll be leftovers at the point when you trim the vegetables, you're cutting the vegetables, and you might only use certain parts. So you can keep the leftovers. And then even if you've made some food and there's some of it that doesn't get eaten, you put it all together, you put it in the compost bin, and then you can also use worms that eat through this vegetable matter, and what they produce fertilizes the soil to produce more vegetables. So the idea is that it's permaculture because it's kind of a closed cycle. What you produce then goes back into the earth, and you don't keep just taking out from it all the time. Permaculture also involves maximizing space and getting the whole of society involved in food production. So that might be everyone participating in growing vegetables. Even if you have a small space or a balcony, you can grow a few things. And then, of course, people need to only buy and consume what they need. Because I'm sure you've heard this statistic before. Currently, a third of food that's produced in the world is wasted. So according to permaculture principles, that of course needs to be eliminated as well, all of that waste. So anyway, I think it would be fair to say that the technological approach I described earlier does have its benefits. But at the same time, you can't deny the fact that society needs to reconnect with nature and drastically reduce the amount of waste it produces. So, I'm not going to take a polarised view on this. I'm going to suggest a very middle-of-the-road solution. What if we could combine the two? Automated permaculture. So you could take these principles of permaculture, for example, the principle of making no waste, and you could use technology to try and make it happen. So even imagine if you could send drones to people's houses to pick up their waste food and then take it to local gardening centres. And then maybe they could deliver compost to people's houses in return. You could use these drones in this way. And you could even maybe use sensors. If someone isn't very good at gardening, you could put a sensor in their house to tell them when their garden needs watering, to make sure, to kind of assist people in overcoming the barriers to local farming. So I think we could combine these two principles together. It might sound like trying to do everything at once, taking technology and new approaches such as permaculture and trying to do it all. But I think that faced with the current situation and the way things are going, we might need to pull out all the stops and combine all the efforts we have to try and make sure that we can guarantee our race's survival.